Well, for starters, let's talk about what TDP even means or what it is, because the definition is like opinions. Everybody's got a different one, quite literally. I don't like to argue much. Like if you see me here on the channel and you may come across a conversation on the threads, I don't really, me personally, I don't like to argue. I think it's a waste of both parties' time to argue about something that they disagree on, especially when it can't be proven or disproven with facts. So I don't really argue, but TDP has, the definition is like opinions. Everybody's got a different one, but the most commonly used term, and they all mean the same thing. But you have thermal design point, right? And that's the most commonly used, or that's the most thermal design power. I'm sorry, is the most commonly used vernacular, right? Thermal design power or perimeter. Sorry, depends. It really depends on who you're talking to, but they all mean the same thing, and it's just the measurement of the maximum amount of heat a CPU or GPU generates under a workload. That workload again could be you could be rendering a video depending on the encoder you're using. You could either be encoding that video on your GPU and or your CPU, or you could be doing some high-end 3D rendering. Those are all loads, and the hotter your part gets, or the hotter the component gets, the more power it's going to generate, right? So that's TDP. Again, the measurement, the maximum amount of heat a CPU or GPU generates under a workload. Gaming puts your GPU under a 100% workload. If you notice, if you track your stats using MSI Afterburner, like XLR gaming overclocks, and anybody else, if you overclock, that's awesome. Tell me down in the comment section if you overclock. Um, something I want to do more, like overclock, especially older hardware, to try to get as much performance out of it that you wouldn't expect otherwise, especially if you can control limiting factors like cooling, right? Always go with the AIO. I want to do some extreme overclocking here and some future content where, I mean, we bring the chiller out. We go big tech, right? We do like some of the big tech tubers are doing. We bring the chiller out. We bring the ice bucket out. I do. I have an RTX 3090. I will possibly need to platform switch if I want to get on the top 100 on Firestrike. I believe it's next in there. Improbable, but anything's possible. But yeah, let me go back over to the chat and get caught up in the chat because I see AVX says they have a 144 hertz 1080p monitor and a 450 watt power supply unit. Okay. Yeah, see, I mean, I think the 3600 has a TDP of 95 watts. I believe an AMD is normally more accurate with their ratings. I believe the 3600 has a TDP of like 95 watts, and the 1650, I'm not sure if you have the super variant or not, but the 1650 has like a max power draw of 90 watts, I believe. So even with the 450 watt power supply, you have a decent amount of overhead to even let GPU boost the graphics card up. Should you have adequate cooling in your case to even just to eke out even a little bit more performance. XLR Gaming says i9 9900K 5.1 gigahertz all cores. Never heard of big ticket show. Okay, I'm not sure if I got the last reference. I do apologize, but that's that's actually pretty. That's about a good place to be on a 9900K. For my 9900K, I hope to maybe shoot for 5.1, maybe 5.2, depending on what I go with the in terms of what I go with a cooler. But yeah, awesome stuff. But now that we know what TDP means, okay, let's talk about how how it's important, why it's important, because we talked about that the harder your PC runs, the more heat it'll generate, and components use electricity, much like your cell phone, my cell phone, your cell phone. Cell phones are miniature computers, if you will. They have processors, they have onboard RAM. Some of them have dedicated video cards inside of them. They are miniature computers. So are tablets, right? It's more concerning that cell phones cost more than a console. Excuse me. The Xbox Series SX and PS5 notwithstanding, but here and before the advent of these newer consoles, PS4 I believe was going for $399, and same thing with the Xbox One, $499. So iPhones were releasing for twice as much as that, right? But cell phones, they generate they generate heat too. I'm sorry. And if you've been playing a game like an intense graphic game, say like Brawl Stars, or I play Clash of Clans, but if you're playing a game for an extended period on your phone, the back of your phone will get hot, right by the battery. It's by the battery. Why is that? The battery is what's providing power to your components. So the longer you're on your phone playing the game, the harder your battery has to work, the more heat that's going to be generated. Um, so yeah, TDP even applies on a phone because phones have a certain heat, a certain temperature they can reach before they shut down. I remember when I had an iPhone, I can't remember which one, so I'm not sure if this is still, somebody could correct me here in the chat. I'm not sure if this is still applicable now, but I had an iPhone, I believe it was a 7 or 7 Plus, I believe. And I would sometimes leave it in the car or throw it on the dash and really forgot about it. And sometimes I would come back and the phone would be so hot, I would have to wait for it to cool down before I could use it. And so, yeah, back to the topic on hand and how we're talking about TDP, because some members here, some people in the PC community, and that's either larger tech channels way bigger than myself. They usually refer to TDP as the maximum amount of power a component can use, and that too is true. Nvidia themselves says that it's both, but in general terms, TDP means to the amount the amount of heat a component generates and cooling components must remove. See, XLR8 made it a very valid point about heat playing a role on how much power you may need for your power supply unit, because there's other parts that have to work to maintain the heat inside of your case. Let's say we're talking about a closed configuration here, a normal case with a side panel. If you're using tempered glass, like I like to use tempered glass, you know that it especially gets especially gets heated in a tempered glass case. But yeah, I mean TDP is to a certain extent the components. It's the amount of heat components generate, and cooling components must be removed. Now, TDP is often a way to measure the system's power draw because they end up being close. But like we talked about earlier in the live stream, that's not always the case, right? Again, with our Intel example, with Intel not listing their TDPs accurately, and they base it off of the base clock speed. But if you have a non-K Intel CPU like a 7500, and it'll only boost up to a certain amount, like there is no amount it can go further. Like the clock speed, I believe, is 7500 for 3400 megahertz, 3.4 gigahertz is what it'll top out. So no amount of cooling is going to help you break that threshold. Like the CPU has a bin TDP that will only let it get so hot to reach that clock speed and no further. But this is why you shouldn't only use TDP to decide the size of your power supply unit. If you're using an overclockable chip like an Intel, all AMD CPUs can boost to you can overclock them manually, but they still very much use PBO 2.0 and or precision boost overdrive, and that will allow the CPU to boost to the highest possible clock speed or frequency that the cooling overhead allows. So AMD is more realistic with their TDP ratings, but Intel's a little bit more shaky, right? Like even if you don't want to overclock, let's say for example you want to go with a 9700K, I believe a 9700K boost all the way up to 4.7 gigahertz or 4700 megahertz. So if the 9700K's TDP might be listed at 125 watts, that's it running at a base frequency of maybe 3.7 gigahertz. Most modern CPUs run at a base frequency of about 3.7 gigahertz or 3.8 gigahertz. I believe 9700K might run at 4.2 gigahertz, but I could be wrong. Could be wrong. But yeah, Intel's is a little bit, is a little lower than what most users experience, but it's usually achieved by default giving adequate cooling. Like if your CPU can boost that high, it will, right? Especially on a K-based CPU. Very important, very important. And it really goes back to when you're overclocking, what you're doing or running. Even if you're overclocking your graphics card, you're running the component past its manufacturer's specifications, right? This is why some people get concerned, like, oh, I overclock. Am I going to ruin my warranty? Chances are you may, depending on what, depending on if you're not careful, and by not careful I mean not knowledgeable about what you're doing. I highly recommend that if you want to overclock your graphics card or your CPU, watch a couple videos. I have some here on the channel. They're kind of blended because overclocking isn't as popular in the community because of the risk versus reward. Some people don't think it's really worth it. I say depending on the game and depending on what you're doing, overclocking your CPU normally gives the fastest results, especially with like speeding up render times on encoding video.